It was the fall of 1998 at Ridgeway High School, a small, aging building nestled at the edge of a sleepy town. The school had always had an eerie reputation, with students often whispering about the strange occurrences that had happened over the years. Most of the stories were dismissed as urban legends, tales designed to scare freshmen. But there was one story that everyone, even the teachers, seemed to treat with a bit more caution: the story of Locker 319. Locker 319 was located in a remote hallway on the third floor of the school, near the old science wing. It was an area that most students avoided if they could, partly because it was far from the main classrooms and partly because of the locker's dark history. For years, students who were unlucky enough to be assigned to that locker would report strange noises, mysterious cold drafts, and an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they opened it. Some claimed they heard whispers coming from inside, even when the locker was empty. The story that circulated the most was about a girl named Emily Sanders. In 1978, she was a quiet, studious junior who often kept to herself. Emily was assigned to Locker 319 at the start of the school year, and she used it as any student would. But as the weeks went by, Emily began to change. Her friends noticed that she became withdrawn, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a sullen and paranoid attitude. She would often be seen staring blankly at her locker, as if lost in thought, or muttering to herself as she stood before it. One day, Emily didn't show up for school. Her parents reported her missing, and a search was conducted throughout the town and surrounding areas. Days turned into weeks, but there was no sign of Emily. Her disappearance became the talk of the town, but with no leads, the case eventually went cold. The only clue was a note found in her locker, written in her handwriting. It simply read, "It's here." The legend of Emily Sanders and Locker 319 persisted over the years, with each new student assigned to it experiencing strange, unsettling events. Some reported books being thrown out of the locker when it was opened. Others felt an icy hand touch them as they reached inside. No one could explain the phenomena, but the fear surrounding the locker only grew. Fast forward to the fall of 1998, when the story took a terrifying new turn. It was the start of the school year, and as usual, students were assigned lockers. Danny Parker, a senior with a reputation for being a skeptic and a bit of a troublemaker, was assigned to Locker 319. When his friends warned him about the locker's history, Danny laughed it off, calling it a bunch of nonsense. He was the kind of guy who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To him, the story of Emily Sanders was just a way to scare freshmen. But the first day Danny used the locker, something strange happened. As he opened it to put away his books, he felt an odd chill. He shrugged it off as a draft from the nearby window, but as the day went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He felt uneasy, but he refused to admit that it had anything to do with the locker. That night, Danny had a vivid nightmare. He was standing in the dimly lit hallway of the school, staring at Locker 319. The locker door was slightly ajar, and a faint, eerie light was emanating from within. As he approached, he heard a soft whisper, indistinct but beckoning him closer. He reached out to open the locker, but as he did, a cold hand grabbed his wrist, pulling him inside. Danny woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to brush it off as just a bad dream, but it felt so real, so terrifyingly real. The next day at school, Danny avoided the locker as much as possible. He didn't mention the nightmare to his friends, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of knowing he was spooked. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Whenever Danny walked past Locker 319, he felt a cold breeze, even though the windows were closed. His books and papers would be mysteriously rearranged or thrown on the floor, and sometimes he thought he heard faint whispers when no one else was around. One day, after football practice, Danny returned to his locker to grab his things. The hallway was empty, and the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the floor. As he approached Locker 319, he noticed that the door was slightly open. He frowned, knowing he had closed it that morning. Cautiously, he pulled the door open wider and was immediately hit by a blast of cold air. Inside the locker, Danny saw something that made his blood run cold. There, Lying on top of his books was an old, yellowed piece of paper. It looked like it had been there for years, the edges frayed and the ink faded. He picked it up with trembling hands and saw that it was a note. The handwriting was shaky, but familiar. It was Emily Sanders' handwriting. The note read, "It's still here." Danny's heart raced as he stared at the note, his mind struggling to make sense of it. How could it be possible? Emily had disappeared 20 years ago. How could her note be in his locker now? And what did it mean by "it's still here"? Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. Danny felt a presence behind him, a cold, malevolent force that made his skin crawl. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But then he heard it, the whispering. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, more insistent. The words were garbled, unintelligible, but they filled Danny with a sense of dread. He backed away from the locker, his eyes darting around the hallway, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing there, only shadows and the oppressive silence of the empty school. Danny's breath came in short gasps as he turned and ran down the hallway, desperate to escape whatever was lurking in the darkness. For the next few days, Danny avoided locker 319 entirely. He used a different locker, borrowing a friend's whenever he needed to store his things. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. The nightmares continued, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. In every dream, Danny found himself standing in front of locker 319, unable to resist the pull of whatever was inside. And each time, he woke up with the same overwhelming sense of fear and dread. It wasn't long before Danny's friends noticed that something was wrong. He was jumpy, irritable, and constantly on edge. He barely slept, and when he did, it was filled with nightmares. His grades started to slip, and he stopped showing up to football practice. When his friends asked him what was going on, he brushed them off, too afraid to admit that he was being haunted by something he didn't understand. But the final straw came one night when Danny's parents were out of town. He was home alone, trying to distract himself with TV, but the anxiety gnawed at him. He kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until he had to go back to school and face that locker again. Around midnight, as he was about to go to bed, he heard a noise coming from the living room. It was a faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. Danny froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to convince himself it was just the house settling, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Slowly, he got up and walked towards the living room, his hands trembling. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering TV screen. As he entered the room, the tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Danny saw something that made his blood run cold. There, on the coffee table, was the same yellowed piece of paper he had found in locker 319. The same note, with the same words, "It's still here." Danny's breath caught in his throat as he backed away, his mind racing. How had the note gotten into his house? He had left it in his locker, hadn't he? But there it was right in front of him, as if mocking him. Suddenly, the TV turned off, plunging the room into darkness. Danny felt a cold breeze brush past him, and then he heard the whispering again. This time, the words were clear, and they sent a chill down his spine. "Come back." The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something sinister about it. Danny turned and ran out of the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he was in his bedroom, the door locked behind him. He grabbed his phone and tried to call his parents, but the line was dead. He tried calling his friends, but no one answered. Danny spent the rest of the night huddled in his bed, too terrified to sleep. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they were all he could hear. It was as if the voice was inside his head, echoing through his mind. When morning finally came, Danny was exhausted, his nerves frayed. He knew he couldn't go on like this. He had to do something, anything, to make it stop. So he decided to confront the source of his fear head-on. That day after school, Danny went back to locker 319. The hallway was empty, the other students having already left for the day. As he approached the locker, he felt the familiar chill, the oppressive sense of dread. But he forced himself to keep going, determined to put an end to this nightmare. He reached the locker and stared at it for a long moment, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. Slowly, he opened the locker, half expecting something to leap out at him. But the locker was empty, save for his books and the yellowed note. Danny took a deep breath and reached inside. As soon as his hand touched the note, the lights in the hallway flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling his ears with their insistent pleas. "Come back. It's still here." Danny's heart raced as he stared into the dark depths of the locker. It felt as though the shadows were closing in on him, suffocating him with their presence. But then he noticed something he hadn't seen before, something that made his blood run cold. At the back of the locker, barely visible in the dim light, was a small, rusted door. It looked like a ventilation grate, but it was slightly ajar, as if it had been opened recently. Danny reached out and pulled the door open, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Danny knew he was standing on the edge of something terrible. But he also knew that he had to find out what was in that tunnel. It was the only way to end this nightmare. Taking a deep breath, Danny crawled into the tunnel. The walls were cold and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. The further he went, the darker it became, until he was crawling in complete darkness, guided only by the sound of the whispers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Danny reached the end of the tunnel. He found himself in a small, hidden room, the walls lined with old, rotting wood. In the center of the room was a single, flickering light bulb, casting eerie shadows across the floor. But what caught Danny's attention was the figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a girl, her back turned to him, her long, dark hair hanging down to her waist. She was wearing an old, tattered school uniform, and her shoulders were hunched, as if she was crying. Danny's breath caught in his throat as he realized who it was. "Emily?" The girl didn't respond. She just stood there, her back to him, the sound of her sobs filling the room. Danny took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, the girl turned to face him. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and translucent. She looked like a ghost, a shadow of the girl she once was. And in her hands, she held the same yellowed note that had haunted Danny for weeks. "It's still here," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Before Danny could react, the room began to shake, the walls closing in around him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to pull him back into the darkness. And then, everything went black. When Danny woke up, he was lying on the floor of the school hallway, right in front of locker 319. The lights were flickering overhead, and the hallway was empty. But the cold, oppressive feeling was gone. The whispers had stopped. Danny sat up, his heart still racing, and looked around. The locker door was closed, and there was no sign of the hidden tunnel or the room he had just been in. It was as if it had all been a terrible nightmare. But as he got to his feet, Danny noticed something in his hand. It was the yellowed note, the same one that had haunted him for weeks. But this time, there was a new message written on it in the same shaky handwriting. "Thank you." Danny stared at the note for a long moment, a sense of relief washing over him. He didn't know what had happened or why, but he knew that the nightmare was finally over. Emily Sanders could rest in peace. And as he walked away from locker 319, Danny knew one thing for certain. He would never, ever forget the haunting of Ridgeway High School.